Alright, so let's talk about complex numbers. First of all, I don't know why it says type something on the bottom. Couldn't get that away. So it's going to have to stay there, so just ignore it. So, if we look at this now, complex numbers, they're also called imaginary numbers because they aren't real, meaning they don't actually exist in the world. They just exist to give us a way to solve some different problems. And there's also some ways that it makes equations easier. There's a whole thing called the complex plane where a lot of different math is possible that's not possible in the real world, and it helps us get through things. So hopefully you remember that an imaginary number is denoted by the letter I, and it's actually equal to the square root of -1, which if you remember, that doesn't exist. Negative square roots can't happen. So you've got to remember I equals the square root of -1. So this is how it works really. So if you have x squared equals -7 and you're trying to solve, you're going to square root both sides. And you're going to get square root of x squared equals square root of -7. And you end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of -7. If you were to separate that out, you get -1 times square root of -1 times square root of 7, which just equals to I square root of 7. If we look at this another way, you get square root of -9. That really just equals to I square root of 9, which equals to I times 3, which is 3I. What happens is if inside a radical is negative, you take out an I and you turn that radical positive. So if you have the square root of -5, you just put I square root of +5. Square root of 10, -10 would be I square root of +10. So just take out the I and leave a positive number inside. You're going to have to memorize this. You don't have to memorize the long way, but you've got to know this, especially when you're simplifying. I to the first power is just I, because I to anything to the first power is just itself. If you have I squared, you got the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, and hopefully you remember when you multiply two square roots by each other, the square root just goes away. So I squared equals -1. And that's going to come up a lot eventually. I cubed is equal to I to the first power times I squared, and as we've already established, I to the first power is just I squared is -1, so you get I times -1, which equals to -I. And I to the fourth power, that's the one that's probably the most important out of all of them. You've got R squared times R squared, which is -1 times -1, which is equals to +1. So I to the fourth power is just +1 every single time. For simplifying, always take out I to the fourth powers because those are ones, and ones don't really affect anything. So you only really need the remainder. So for example, if you have I to the 9th power, and this is a long way of doing it, and I don't recommend doing this, it's really I to the 4th times I to the 4th times I to the first power, which is 1 times I to the first power, which is I to the first power, which just equals to I. So I to the 9th power equals to I. It just simplifies it all the way down to that. The simpler way to do it is just do 9 divided by 4, which is 2, the remainder 1. So now you know that it's just I to the first power because that's the remainder, which is just I. So if you had I to the 42 power, basically I would just do 42 divided by 4. You get 10 remainder 2, which means really you're just looking for I to the 2nd power, which if you've memorized is -1. What you guys are going to do with complex numbers mostly is when you're solving quadratic formula, it's going to come up. So if we have x squared plus 2x plus 2 equals 0, we have a equals 1, b equals 2, and c equals 2. We plug it into our x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. You end up with -2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2 all over 2 times 1. That turns into x equals -2 plus or minus 4 minus 8 over 2, which turns into -2 plus or minus negative square root of 4 over 2. And what happens is now, like I said, when you have a negative square root, you take that I and you put it out front. So you got -2 plus or minus I squared root of 4 over 2. But luckily we know what the square root of 4 is. The square root of 4 is just 2. And so we get -2 plus or minus 2I over 2. which since they're all divisible by 2, you can just divide it and you end up with -1 plus or minus I. So you can use quadratic formula, and now we can get unreal answers. From that last section, hopefully you remember that if you have the square root of a negative number, we said there's no real solutions. And there's no real solutions. We only got 2 imaginary solutions. And that's about it. Yep.